Thank you, Marcy. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to set the timer to make sure that I don't go over, as I often tend to do. Um, I think I was last on this stage about 8 years ago, which reminds me of a story that I once heard from a fellow author, that an author is like one of these insects that's buried underground and then comes up for 2 weeks and flies around and buzzes, then gets swatted down by a critic and disappears for another 8 years. So here I am, and let me start off by trying to give you a sense of how I came to the seemingly preposterous conclusion that the world needs another book on the American Revolution. This book is about a perspective on the Revolution that was new to me when I started, and I hope it will be new to you. But at the same time, I also think it's a perspective that it was really just forgotten. So about 10 years ago, or even before I last appeared here on the stage of world history, I started reading more deeply into the American Revolution and into the philosophical writings of America's founders, some of the more famous ones and also some of the less well-known ones. And the short story of it is that I was incredibly surprised. I was astonished. I came at this as a historian of philosophy. My interest has generally been in ancient philosophy and in early modern philosophy. I thought all the interesting things happened over there, as it were. But I was incredibly impressed. I was proud in a certain way to be an American. I was a little bit weirded out. I mean, at one point I discovered that a lot of these founders were into space aliens. I mean, I'll explain that in more detail in a moment, but seriously, extraterrestrials were a big thing. And so I began to feel that, at least on philosophical matters, this was a generation of leaders that whose equal we have not seen since. And at the same time, as I was discovering this hidden side of America's philosophical past, I started to become quite indignant. And let me just lay my cards out on the table here. I think America's founders have been kidnapped by the religious right. And I'll just tell you right now that, in my view, and I'll try to justify this more later, the Christian nation myth is something worse than a myth, something worse than a falsehood or misinterpretation. I see it as something of a betrayal of the American Revolution. And I think it represents precisely the kind of thing that Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and others were fighting against. And I'll try to justify that a little bit later on. But let me also say that my main reason for taking on this project was not to engage in polemics. It's wonderful to point out that people are wrong, but my main concern here was actually to say something about this incredibly rich philosophical heritage that America has and that has not received enough attention. And I think it was also important for me because this encounter with America's philosophical past provoked me to address some very high-level questions. I don't necessarily answer them in the book, and I'm not going to answer them for you here, but I'll just list them out and maybe stimulate you to think about them. One is just, what is the meaning of the American Revolution? Why is it important? Does it even matter at all? Why do we care about these people in breeches? Did they change the world in any significant way? I think that they did, but it's important to try to understand what that is. It also provoked me to think about the foundations of liberalism. So we now pretty much take for granted that democracy is the best form of government. Very few people dispute the idea that all people are equal in some sense. We all are eager to claim our rights, but why? Why do we believe in these things? I think that this study of America's founders can reveal a lot about the deeper foundations of liberalism. And then it even made me think more abstractly about the role of ideas in history. So it's easy to say that ideas matter, but which ideas matter? And more importantly, does the truth matter? I mean, do ideas have to be true to matter? So those are some of the abstract questions that motivated this project. And I'm going to beat a quick retreat from that very high level of generality and introduce you to some of the characters that stimulated me at the beginning of this project that got me going. So there are a couple of minor characters in the Revolution, or they're not so minor, but they're not major either, that form a part of this story, but they were really important for me at the beginning of the project because they were the ones who sort of introduced me to this hidden side of the Revolution. One was Ethan Allen. Okay, he's not a furniture magnate, right? We're clear on that, right? That was a cruel irony of history where some New York businessmen. Ethan Allen spent his time basically fighting the New Yorkers, and some New York businessmen decided to call their furniture Ethan Allen furniture. The irony. No, he was a rough specimen. He was a mountain man. You may have heard of him as the leader of the Green Mountain Boys. He became famous for the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. But he was an uneducated man. He said himself that he learned everything from the mountainous wilds of America. And yet, from an early age, there was something unusual about Ethan, and that's that he was an infidel. From the age of 18 on, he was known as one who professed not to believe in any form of the Christian religion. So on retiring from the war, what did this mountain man infidel do? A very unusual thing. He wrote a really long book, a 477-page book. I feel I'm one of the first people who have read this book in a very long time. I can't back that up, but I feel that way. It's called Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, or the Oracles of Reason, he called it too. And in Vermont, they called it Ethan Allen's Bible, in an ironic way. Here's what you need to know about Ethan Allen's Bible. First, it's not a particularly good book. It's not a bad book, but it's just not great. Ethan Allen is definitely an infidel. He says in his preface that he's not sure if he's a deist. I'm going to say a little bit more about that term. But he says he's not sure if he's a deist, but because he hasn't read any of the books of the deists. After all, he doesn't read. He's out there in the mountains. But one thing he's sure of is that he's not a Christian. Which brings up a third really crucial point, which is that even though Ethan Allen says that he's not a deist, and that he hasn't read any of these books on philosophy, when you read his book, what you come across is an astonishing number of arguments, phrases, tropes, claims that come straight out of books written by deist philosophers. In fact, even the title of Ethan Allen's book, Oracles of Reason, is the title of a book by one of the notorious deist philosophers in England, Charles Blount, who wrote a book called The Oracles of Reason in 1693. But I saw something a little bit more than that, more than just a repetition of certain deist tropes. I saw many pieces of arguments that were a lot more interesting, a lot richer, more sophisticated than what we today associate with the term deism. So, and just to give you an illustration now, I mentioned the space aliens before. One of the ideas that Ethan Allen puts out is that the universe is eternal. No beginning, no end. It's infinite in extension. There's no center. Everywhere it's pretty much the same stuff. And there are space aliens everywhere. Every star is surrounded by planets, and there's space aliens there. So that for me was very intriguing. I saw that same idea in many other texts, and I know I can trace the history of that concept and show the role that it plays. And by the way, the history of space aliens turns out to be pretty much the history of modern political thought. So Ethan Allen's book was really intriguing to me. It was a real problem for some of the early mythologizers who started writing American history in the 19th century, because they wanted Ethan Allen to be this war hero, a kind of muscular, non-thinking kind of character, and they couldn't reconcile that with the fact that he'd written this book, this irreligious book, that seemed to be pretty well informed. So they came up with this theory that he didn't actually write his own book. And they pinned the blame on a guy named Thomas Young. So it was kind of a lobotomy thing. They basically said he can't be that smart, so somebody else must have done it. And actually, until recently, this was, well, in fact, until my books come out, basically, this was pretty much the accepted theory that Thomas Young wrote Ethan Allen's book. So I think I can pretty well debunk that theory, but I'm glad I found it because it introduced me to Thomas Young. Now, can I ask for like a show of hands? Aside from people who have met me and heard me talk enthusiastically about Thomas Young, does anybody know who Thomas Young is? You do. Okay. Oh, we'll have to talk. Right. The rest of you think you're American history buffs, but look, let me tell you about Thomas Young, and perhaps you can fill in some of the details. And so he was born in 1731 in upstate New York to a poor Irish immigrant family. In 1765, he shows up as the leader of the Sons of Liberty in Albany, and he kicks off the Stamp Act riots there. Very important initial act of resistance against our British overlords. He then moves to Boston, becomes a key figure in the radical political faction here that was led by Sam Adams and James Otis at the time. In 1770, he's involved in the Boston Massacre. He's a doctor. He